Once upon a time, there was a boy named Cinderfella.
It's like a dream, a wonderful dream.
They might be dear to our childhood, but nowadays many of the fairy tales we read as kids may seem a little outdated, especially on the gender front. Luckily, an increasing number of live-action remakes of traditional fairy tales aim to overturn those sexist stereotypes. Take, for example, Disney's 2017 adaptation of Beauty and the Beast. As opposed to the traditional fairy tale, actress Emma Watson says her character Belle represents a more progressive role model for little girls.
There's this very progressive, defiant Belle that clearly wants to empower herself and to empower other girls that she sees living where she lives, and she wants more for them than just to marry the village Gaston, which she thinks is pretty depressing in terms of prospects.
Word did appear.
And the transformation seems to be all-encompassing. In Frozen, Elsa runs her own country. Maleficent is the ruler of the Moors. And rather than the helpless damsel she was in the traditional Cinderella fairy tale, in Disney's Ever After, Danielle is a sassy, resilient character, supposedly active in her own destiny.
Just breathe.
But how successful have modern-day remakes really been in reversing gender stereotypes? Some critics suggest that despite minor changes, contemporary retellings of fairy tales continue to perpetuate patriarchal ideologies.
Look at her. What if she is the one? The one who'll break the spell?
Media outlets like Quartz argue that just because Belle is played by Watson, one of Hollywood's leading feminists, doesn't make the film progressive. On the contrary, despite portraying her as an inventor, Disney's new Belle invents nothing other than a washing machine. And what ultimately tames the beast isn't Belle's intelligence or her wit, but rather her beauty and her inclination to nurture. Similar criticism has been applied to female protagonists in the movies Frozen and Maleficent. Gender scholars like Alison Kilmer writes that despite establishing self-sufficient, independent female protagonists, both films still project them as being controlled by their emotions.
Please, just stay away!
Fearful of her own powers, Elsa locks herself in her room crying for days.
I can't.
Disney's Mulan, on the other hand, has been praised by film critics like Roger Ebert as one of the most progressive modern takes on gender and sexuality. And it's no wonder.
What's this? Notes?
The story originates from an 11th century ballad centered on themes like patriotism, duty to family, and female strength.
They must be swift as the coursing river.
But how far can feminist tropes really go before losing the plot? Despite being praised for its flipping of gender roles, Orion's Gretel and Hansel has been criticized for turning the original fairy tale into a story about Gretel's self-discovery.
This is your power.
And, as suggested by arts columnist Amanda Hess, if implemented too explicitly, feminist-themed movies risk being locked into a genre of their own. Salome van Zyl, TRT World.
For more on this, let's turn to Kendra Reynolds. She's researched modern and postmodern fairy tales in conjunction with gender theory. She also wrote the book, The Feminist Architecture of Postmodern Anti-Tales. Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. So, first off, tell us how successful these modern-day fairy tales been in reversing gender stereotypes.
So on the one hand, you have fairy tale retellings. I'm thinking of Kenneth Branagh's Cinderella live action remake, for example, or Beauty and the Beast starring Emma Watson. These do little to challenge the actual ideologies of the patriarchal fairy tales. They simply retell them with a kind of different aesthetic and maybe revise simplistic elements of plot. On the other hand, I study anti-tales. I see these as more radical feminist revisions of the original stories in that they challenge the fundamental architecture of the fairy tales. So the fairy tale is a world built upon binaries. So there's a black and white morality of good and evil. On the one hand, you have men, on the other, you have women. And one of these dualities is always privileged over the other. So it's this kind of fundamental architecture that real radical retellings undo. And I think a good example of this is Disney's Maleficent.
Okay, so this is perfect where you brought us to. I'm going to come back to Maleficent and I'm going to come back to Anti-Tales, of course. But please, let's talk about Beauty and the Beast, Disney's 27 edition. What did you think was problematic there?
I think critics kind of praised the fact that it was faithful to the classical original Disney retelling of the story, but it did little to counteract marriage as the ultimate fulfillment for women. Belle didn't really have a more active role. Yes, she's shown as being bookish, but beyond that, it's not really progressive for women in any kind of way. It doesn't do anything to challenge the original framework.
Okay, so you would say that this Disney's Beauty and the Beast was actually perpetuating patriarchal ideology, even though it said that it was fighting against it.
Yes, I believe that it was. I believe if you're going to really do a radical fairy tale retelling, it needs to fundamentally undermine some of the original architecture or ideologies. And I don't think that the story in that film actually did that. I think it was almost a pure retelling in that respect. Okay, so let's talk about Maleficent for a second, because you say that it's a good example, but then not everyone agrees with you. For example, Samantha Abramovitz from The Quietus says that it's actually a very safe form of feminism that they're trying to portray there, and it doesn't really complicate the social structure from which Disney benefits. What do you say to that? Yeah, it's interesting. Inevitably, in children's films and in Disney, it's not going to go as far as the art house films, for example, in complicating plot, etc. And it's not going to be as experimental. But what the film does is it sets up this binary structure. So it does set up the fairy tale architecture of good and evil and the two separate binary kingdoms at the start of the Moors and the human kingdom. But it deliberately sets those up so that it can deconstruct them. And it does this through Maleficent's character. She becomes that kind of in-between complicated space, a kind of anti-heroine. And again, her story provides a subtext, which means that the frame of the old story will be broken for all of those viewers who see the film and go back to the original story. They will always see her motivations behind it. So this is fundamentally challenging the old story because it's bringing in that extra layer. And so it's kind of undermining it in that way. So yes, I agree that it does set up those binaries, but it does ultimately undo them in the end as well.
Okay, Kendra Reynolds, good to have you on our show today. Thank you so much.